Christy. Welcome back to my channel and welcome to day 17 of my 2020 holiday card series. Today I'm going to be using this stamp set from the Colorado Craft Company. This is a set that is illustrated by Anita Jerum, the illustrator of Guess How Much I Love You, and it's called Snow Happy. So I stamped this scene out in MFT's Extreme Black Hybrid ink, directly on the panel that I'm going to be using as my focal panel, and I'm going to start by coloring in my background. I think it's a lot easier to get that out of the way now than to color the image and then worry about possibly pulling some of the other coloring into the sky or getting some of that blue into the other images. If I do it now and I have a little mistake, I can remove some of that with my colorless blender, but once the image is colored, it's kind of hard to take it away. So the sky I'm coloring with B00, B41, B52, and B45. So I started with that B45 down at the bottom, and I'm flicking up in a kind of feathering motion, and then I'm bringing in the B52 as my first midtone, my darker midtone I should say, and then I'm going to grab my B41 and continue flicking that color up towards the top of the scene and just blending out the edge of the color previous. So in this case, it's the B52. I will say that doing a background like this does require a bit of ink, so you want to make sure that you're using markers that you've either recently refilled or are kind of fresh, that you've maybe purchased recently and haven't used all that much, because if your markers are dry, you're going to get a lot of streakiness. I'm actually bringing in the B00 next, and this one does need a bit of a refill, so I have to press down with a little more pressure to get that to blend nicely. And I am going to go over this entire background with a second layer as well, just to increase that saturation and smooth out any transition areas. So there you can see that with the second layer. I went ahead and put away the B45 because I wasn't going to need that anymore, but I am going to continue working with the other three shades to color in the snow. So I'm going to do the drift at the very top of the scene there, and then all of those little lines that the artist has drawn. I'm going to go over those as well, just to add some depth. Since this is a night scene, there would be a lot of shadow underneath of those. So once I laid those in with the B52, I started to blend them out with the B41, and then I will go over that again with the B00, and then let that fade into the white areas. So I'm just going to continue working and kind of softening the edge of that, and I think that really adds a lot of nice detail to this little scene here. So next I want to tackle the tree, and I wanted to use brown tones that were not similar to the brown tones I'm going to use on the deer. So I went with E44, E47, and E49. These brown tones have a lot of gray mixed into them, so I think it works well for this scene. I'm starting with the E49 and using the very tip of that marker because some of those branches are super thin, and just adding a little bit of shading here and there. I'm not putting it on the entire length of every branch because I think that would just be too much, because a lot of them are just super sketchy, especially toward the ends. So just adding a bit here and there so that it gives that look of some shading there. Once I had the E49 laid in, I began to blend that out with the E47, and then I'm going to continue with the E44. And at this point I realized that I was going to need a fourth shade again, just because I wanted a lot of contrast. And in order to get a lot of contrast, you need very darks and also very lights so that there's a wide, difference between the spectrum of color on an object. So once I have this E44 laid in, I'm going to pull in the E43, and that's going to be my lightest shade. So I'm going to fill in any white areas, and once I have all of the branches kind of filled in, I'm going to take this one and just trace over those little sketchy thin branches as well, just to add a bit of color on there. And again, I'm just using that very tip of my marker and very light pressure so that I can get a really super thin line, so that, it's just barely there. It just gives it a little bit something extra rather than just having the plain black lines. Next, I'm moving on to my plants, and I'm going to use G46 and G29 for those. Just 2 shades on those leaves because they're so super tiny. So I'm going through and just dotting in a little of that G29 first, and then I'm going to blend over that with the G46. And I could have gone with a lighter combo, but I wanted to cover up some of that blue. I did get some blue on there on my second pass over the background, so those darker greens just covered up any of that. For the leaves on the trees, I wanted them to be a different shade. I just wanted to take the opportunity to add some different color, and I figured they would probably be brown by the time the snow has fallen. So I went with kind of yellow tones that have a lot of brown in them. I used YR24 and YR27 and just colored them in the same way that I did the green leaves. Then I'm going to move on to my deer, and I'm going to use E50, E51, E53, and E55. So E55 and E53 can sometimes not play nicely together, and so I almost went with a different combo, but this really is the closest to what a deer hide looks like in my opinion. So I decided to just go for it, especially since I'm using very little of that E55, and it ended up working just fine. I didn't get any areas where they tried to pull away from each other, which they sometimes like to do. So I added my shading on the front of the deer's legs because he is kind of leaning forward, leaning down to the bunny. So I just figured the shadows would be on that part of the body because his, the top half of his body is casting the shadow down on the lower part. So once I had that E55 laid in on the front of his legs, I also put some on his back and the backs of his ears and the top and bottom of his head and on his neck, because I didn't want the dark shadows on his belly because I wanted it to get down to a nice kind of white belly like a deer has. So that's why I started with my darkest at the top of his back rather than the underbelly. So I blended out with the E53, and now I'm using that E51 to fill in even more of that, making sure to color over the edge of that E53 and get it to break up and just blend nicely. I did color the deer with a second layer as well. I often do that, especially with larger objects, because it just smooths out everything and it increases the saturation, and I just love super saturated objects. It's just the style of coloring that I enjoy. So then I'm filling in the rest with the E50, and you can see that I left that belly area white, as well as the muzzle and the tail, and I also left some little white socks on his feet. So I'm moving on to my bunny, and I didn't want him to be brown as well because we already have the tree and the deer, so I decided to do a gray and white bunny. So I'm using C0, C1, and C3, and I'm just doing a little simple shading first. I used the C3 and then blended out with the C1 and used a little bit of the C0. And I'm kind of giving him a patch down his back and also on the top of his head. And this was kind of just the initial layer. I'm going to add the C5 in now and do some extra detail. So I'm going to give him one dark gray ear, and then I'm going to give him some spots on the other ear, and then I'm going to darken up the little patch on his head and down his back with that C5 as well. And I really wanted to do this especially on this image because whenever I need to color bunnies in different ways, which is something I absolutely love to do, they are my favorite image to color of all time. I always look up Anita Jerum's illustrations because she is amazing and so talented, and I always look at her, her images that she's drawn for inspiration of how to color my own bunnies. So I definitely had to do something a little extra on this one since it was illustrated by her. I also wanted to give the deer a black muzzle because I was looking at photos of deer before I started coloring this image, and I really liked the ones that had the black muzzle. It just really drew me in. So I used the C3 and C5 for that. And then they also often had like a little white stripe behind the between the black and the brown. So I'm going to grab my colorless blender and push back some color on the ears to keep those white on the tips. And then I'm just going to go over that transition area between the black and the brown to deepen that up. I'll use a black gel pen to go over their eyes. And then I'm going to take a white gel pen, and I wanted to add some snow to the branches. I am going to come back and do some snowfall on the image later on as well. I just didn't want to do it right now because I was afraid if I dotted it all over the critters that when I die cut this panel, when I ran it through my die cutting machine, that maybe some of those little tiny dots might smear. But I was less worried about it on these branches. So I'm just taking that white gel pen, which is a Sakura jelly roll pen, and kind of just scribbling right above the black outline of any of the branches that are more horizontal so that they would be catching some of that snow. So I'm just kind of drawing that in there, not super thick, but because those branches are pretty thin anyway, so they wouldn't be able to hold a lot. I'm going to take one of the MFT wonky stitch rectangle stacks, and I'm going to position that over the image, kind of get the placement just how I want it, and then I'll hold that down with a little bit of post-it tape and run that through my die cutting machine. Then I'm going to pop that panel into my MISTI so that I can stamp my sentiment, and I'm using Lawn Fawn's lobster ink to stamp the one that says Snow Happy. And there's a few good ones in this set, but I just needed one that was teeny tiny that would just fit in that upper left hand corner. So this one worked perfect for that. I did stamp that down a couple of times to make sure I had a good impression. And then because I'm using a dark red card base for my card, I decided to finish off the inside with an insert. So I die cut a piece of plain white cardstock with one of the Lawn Fawn large stitch rectangle stackables. And I'm stamping Have a Snow Happy Day and then the larger bunny image in that same lobster ink. The pattern papers that I'm using are from the Lumberjack Christmas by Echo Park. And I wanted to use this buffalo plaid check. I really love that. And then this print here that had the little pine cones. I thought that was really pretty with it. And I also liked the wood grain stripes on the back. So I've trimmed those out with the largest of the large stitch rectangle stackables. And basically I just cut down 2 panels of each of the plaid and the other pattern with the pine cones, and then I used a paper trimmer to cut them in half. So I'll be able to make 2 card fronts from this 2 pieces of pattern paper there. So I just put the plaid on the bottom half, and then I'm putting the pine cone print on the top half. And then rather than cut the wood grain piece straight across, I decided to follow the lines that were already drawn. So I just used a pair of scissors to just cut along those lines. And then I'm going to glue that. At first I was going to put it over the seam, but then I realized that you wouldn't be able to see very much of it. The focal panel was going to cover up everything except for the edges. So I decided to put that a little bit lower on the card, kind of ground that focal panel at the bottom there, and it would just expose more of that wood grain look, which I thought went well with the subject matter of the focal panel. So I'm going to glue in my insert before I go any farther there, just centering that so I get a nice bright red border on the edges. And then I will add my focal panel, which I have added some foam tape to the back of. So I'll just peel off those release papers and line that up in the center of the card and pop that down into place. So now I'm ready to come back with that white gel pen and add the snowfall. And I'm just adding some different size dots all over the background. It doesn't show up super well on the top part of the card where the sky is really light, but you can definitely see it a lot better down below. But I added it all over just to make sure that it was covered. And I'm going to go right over my little critters as well, because the snow would be falling all around, not just behind them. So just picking and choosing places where I don't mind having that snow cover up some of their bodies. So I'm going to continue adding that. I'm also going to add some snow to the little plants, just like I did with the branches, because they would also be collecting some of that snowfall. So just doing like quick little scribbles right on the leaves, and especially in the places where two leaves are kind of forked, where that snow would gather. And of course I had to add some of my favorite Stardust stickles, so I'm adding that right over the edges of the snowfall and any of the little shadows. And then I'm also going to add it to the whites of the snow in the trees and bushes. And normally I say to be careful about this because the liquid that's in the liquid glue, the wet glue, it will make your white gel pen kind of melt and dissolve. But in this case, I kind of didn't mind if that happened because it was going to blend in with the snow that's on the trees anyway. So I just decided to go for it, and it ended up working out fine. So I added it even on the little plants and everything. And then I also decided to add some to the snowfall in the background, just dotting it here and there, and even going over the animals just like I did with that white gel pen. So I'm going to lift that up to the camera and tip it into the light so you can see how it sparkles and shines. I just love that stickle so much. And I'll give you another peek at the inside. I think these images are just so adorable, and they were such a pleasure to work with. If you enjoyed this one, please be sure to hit that like button and subscribe and ring that notification bell so you don't miss any future videos. I post new ones every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And if you're interested in any of the products that I used today, you'll find those listed and linked below the video in the description bar. If you'd like to keep watching, here are 2 videos from previous years of holiday card series. You can click on either one of those to check them out. I hope you all have an absolutely amazing day. Bye-bye.